500 years ago, the German-speaking lands of Central Europe were gripped by mass revolt. Beginning in 1524 and continuing into 1525, the German Peasants War involved hundreds of thousands of the poor. Europe would not see such widespread revolt again until the French Revolution of 1789. The peasants wanted equality, to feed their families and to be free of the petty and often vicious control of the feudal lords. But some went further and challenged the whole logic of the system. Thomas Müntzer, who we'll talk about later, was among the most radical. He declared, "What is the evil brew from which all usury, theft and robbery springs, but the assumption of our lords and princes that all their creatures are their property? The fish in the water, the birds in the air, the plants on the face of the earth. It all has to belong to them." And he concluded, "It is the lords themselves who make the poor man their enemy. If they refuse to do away with the causes of insurrection, how can trouble be avoided in the long run? If saying that makes me an inciter to insurrection, so be it." The parallels with the modern world, where capitalism exploits us at work, that's the theft and robbery, and is destroying the environment, are striking. Martin Empson, a member of Solidarity's sister organisation in Britain, the Socialist Workers Party, has just published a book that brings this story of revolt to life. It's entitled "The Time of the Harvest Has Come, Revolution, Reformation and the German Peasants War." And I'll put a link in the show notes if you're interested in getting a copy. Martin joins us today from the northern English city of Manchester to discuss what drove this revolt, what was the role of religion, what visions of a future society did it contain, and why it was defeated. You're listening to The Sound of Solidarity, brought to you by Solidarity. We're a revolutionary socialist group in Australia, and if you'd like to find out more about us, our website is solidarity.net.au. I'm David Glanz, and I'm recording this episode on unceded Wurundjeri land in Narm, or Melbourne. So welcome, Martin.
It's a pleasure to be here to talk about the book, and greetings and solidarity to comrades in Australia.
Thank you, and vice versa, of course. Look, congratulations on the book. Any book is a long and sometimes painful labour of love. What made you choose to focus on the events of 500 years ago?
It's a good question, and I think as the book comes out and people ask me, why is this relevant? I think it's important that we have an answer. The first thing I'd say is that I think it's really important that radicals and socialists today celebrate the forgotten episodes of revolt in the past, when ordinary women and men have risen up to fight for a better life for themselves and their families and communities, and to challenge the people who are exploiting and oppressing them. And we know that history often neglects these stories, and indeed the story of the German Peasants War 500 years ago is one of those forgotten episodes of revolutionary struggle. I think the second reason is that because it's the 500th anniversary, there is inevitably going to be a number of books, articles, television programs, debates, discussions and commemorations of the event. And I think it's important that revolutionary socialists today and Marxists put their own understanding and explanation of these events of the past in front of an audience, because that leads into the final point, which is the German Peasants' War happens not at a random moment in history, but at a particular conjuncture of historical development in Europe. The emergence of the beginnings of capitalist mode of production within the European economy, and great changes that are resulting from that. And it means that the system that we live in today, capitalism, has been marked from its very birth by enormous upheavals, enormous class struggles, and an enormous resistance from the people who are being exploited and oppressed by it. And I think it's important that we discuss these to understand where our world has come from and to gain inspiration for the struggles for a better future for a socialist society.
Maybe we can say a bit more about that context before we get on to the story of the revolt itself. As you pointed out, this is a period when European settlers, invaders, colonists were beginning to arrive in the Americas, and Europe was starting to go through the transition from feudalism, which was a system based on land ownership and the exploitation of the peasants, to capitalism, which is a system, unfortunately, we know too well today. So how did that shape the revolt?
The first thing to understand is that what's taking place in the central part of Europe at the time, which we'll loosely call Germany, even though it's beyond the sort of borders of modern day Germany, is a very slow process of transformation in the economy. Up until the sort of 16th century, as you say, David, the world of the European economy is dominated by agricultural production. Almost everybody in European society is a peasant in this time, and if they're not a peasant, they're very closely linked to the peasant economy, dependent upon it, either for their own wealth or because they are producing goods and trading with the peasants. And this is beginning to change at the end of the 15th and the early 16th century. Europe is beginning to go through a process of transformation. This is partly epitomised by the arrival in the New World, as it was called, of European explorers, settlers and colonists and so on, who bring or send back to Europe vast amounts of wealth in terms of natural resources, gold and so on. And this has an effect. It stimulates the trading economy. It encourages people who are, making their own money through trade and merchant behaviour and so on. And it begins to encourage and help develop the production within Europe that is not based simply on satisfying the needs of a peasant family or the wants of the peasants' lords, but on production for profit. This, of course, builds on the processes that have been changing on very small developments inside the European economies. And in Germany in the 16th century is perhaps a little bit further backward than other countries in what we now call Europe. Nonetheless, these processes are very, very real, and you start to see, particularly in the cities, the development of production as we would begin to recognise it under capitalism. People coming together and manufacturing goods that are sold for profit on the market rather than to satisfy, as I said, their individual needs. Allied to this, and we'll come back to this later in the discussion, I'm sure, there are a number of political ideological changes taking place caused by the tensions between the new methods of production and the old economy. And principally in Germany and Central Europe at the beginning of the 16th century, you see a massive upheaval in the Christian church, stimulated and encouraged and begun really by a man called Martin Luther, a hitherto relatively unknown theologian who is teaching at a university in the small German town of Wittenberg, and he begins what is now known as the Reformation, a challenge to the existing Catholic Church, a challenge to the Pope and its institutions and all its figures over a number of different issues that ultimately leads to a big rift within Christianity and a massive ideological questioning of the status quo. And this forms the context for the mass uprising that we now know as the German Peasant War. You have the changes at the economic bottom of society as production is beginning to transform itself, and you also have at the top of society and filtering down through the masses a great ferment of ideas as ordinary people, indeed everyone in society, is debating and discussing how society should be organised and how people should worship and what sort of institutions are needed to best facilitate this process.
We'll come back to the question of religion in a little bit because I think that's particularly interesting. But first of all, about the peasantry themselves, as you say, they were the overwhelming majority of the population in Europe in 1525, they didn't know that society was going through a transition. We can see that with the benefit of hindsight and the benefit of the development of Marxist tools of analysis. So for the peasants, the immediate driver for the revolt would have been much more immediate in their lived experience, because revolutions don't come out of the blue. So what were the peasants angry about?
That's a very good question, and there are a number of different answers to this that interlock. But the principal driver of the rebellion is the exploitation and the oppression of the mass of the population by a tiny number of incredibly wealthy individuals, the landowners who were either lords or princes or monarchs or nobility of some form. And as you said in your introduction, David, the European society at the time was a feudal society. Essentially, small numbers of landowners were able to exact and exploit the peasants who were working on the land and take a percentage of what they produced for their own consumption. So every single peasant and every single peasant household wasn't free to do as they wanted with with what they grew in their fields, or the animals they raised, or the materials they might gather from the woods, or so on. Everything they did involved a set of transactions where a certain amount of goods, of production, of crops or whatever would have to be handed over to those above them. And this was principally the landowners, the nobility. It was also the church, and the church enacted what you might loosely call taxes on the mass of the population, in addition to the oppression and exploitation of the ruling class, of the nobility and the landowning class. At the same time, the peasants themselves weren't ignorant and somehow stupid and not interested in other worlds. They were being pressured and buffered by the other wider economic forces in society, and as the Middle Ages had developed, there had been some pressure on the landowning class to try and extract more wealth from the peasantry. There were a number of reasons for this. The innumerable and endless wars between different blocks of feudal rulers, between different lords fighting to try and get each other's land, to gather their own, to increase their own wealth, and so on. Other pressures included the drive and the encouragement of the landowning class to constantly divide up land and redistribute it so they could have more small holdings and more peasants to produce wealth for them. So there are all numberable pressures upon the peasants, and at various points in German history, up until even before the Peasants' War began, this exploded in revolt. It's true everywhere under capitalism that people can only be exploited so much before they decide that they're going to revolt and resist and fight back. And that was also true in feudal society. And there have been a number of great rebellions in German history, which I talk a bit about in the book, often given interesting names like the Paul Conrad's revolt a few years before the Peasant War broke out. But in 1524, the sort of dam burst, and a very small rebellion, initially by a group of peasants in an area very south of Germany called Schlingen, breaks out and encourages and spreads like wildfire across the sort of southern half of the Holy Roman Empire. And very soon, hundreds of thousands of peasants are up in arms, literally forming bands and laying siege to the nobility.
All right, enough of the prelude and the scene setting. Let's get down to the revolt. How did it unfold? What were the peasants demanding, and how did they organise?
Well, again, there's all sorts of different answers to this, because the revolt was geographically very, very diverse. It covered most of what we now call southern Germany, but also parts of France, areas of Switzerland, large sections of Austria, and even into sort of the eastern parts of Europe. And so the demands are very much tied up with the issues that we've already been talking about, the questions of exploitation and oppression, and also religious issues come very into many of the peasants' demand. And we're very, very lucky. There are hundreds and hundreds of surviving documents from the period which articulate the peasants' demands. And in the book, I very much try and use the words of the peasants themselves, because they are fascinating to read 500 years later, as they call for particular demands. Most famously, the peasants articulated a series of demands known today as the 12 Articles, and these were written down in a series of meetings that take place in the small German town of Memmingen in March of 1525. Fascinating, I think, for socialists is that these were not written by people from the top down. They were produced by delegates. The peasant bands that arose as the rebellion broke out in different areas coalesced together, and often forming armies of thousands and thousands of peasants. And they elected delegates, they elected their leaders, they elected their officials, and they created a sort of overarching set of demands known as the 12 Articles, as I said, written in March of 1525, almost exactly 500 years ago today, actually. And these articles are fascinating to read. We know they were fascinating to us. They were also fascinating at the time because we know that they were printed in thousands and thousands of copies of pamphlets and newspapers that were distributed across Germany, and they were then used by further groups of peasants who were coming into revolt as the basis for their own demands. And the articles, both the 12 Articles and the articles that arise from rebellion in different parts of Germany, have a number of similar sets of demands. And what's fascinating about them is they often link big political questions and religious questions with local economic desires. An end to serfdom, for instance, the ending of the old feudal order, the ending of the extremely repressive legal institution of serfdom was one big demand for the peasants. The peasants often demanded, for instance, the right to fish or exploit natural resources that are around them, forests and woodland and so on, for their own interests rather than have them privately owned by the local lord. And then there are all sorts of often local demands that might have related to things like tolls or taxes or tithes from the church. And then you also have the religious demands, which are obviously heavily influenced by the Reformation that had begun 7 or 8 years previously in Wittenberg. And these include demands which we today might seem a little bit strange, but I always think that they're really about communities wanting to have more control over their future and what's being done and said in their own villages and so on. So, for instance, most groups wanted to elect their own preachers, their own priests. This again might seem a bit odd to us, but at the time the priests were selected by the landowners. So effectively they were the mouthpiece of the ruling class in the area, and their preaching and their sermons would not be about teaching the peasantry religion or the Bible or whatever. They would be about being the mouthpiece of the ruling class, talking and saying what the landowner would want. And the peasantry very often, certainly in the 12 Articles, wanted to have priests who would help them understand the Bible and help them understand religion, rather than having it filtered through someone else's voice, if you like. And so these and related demands are really about control over your natural resources that are around you, control over your own village, the right to select officials and so on, like priests, obviously, but also people who would pass judgment in courts and so on, and really a levelling down of society. So it's less hierarchical and more democratic, a real coming together of what you might call political and economic issues tied together. And the revolt, as I say, involved literally tens of thousands of peasants. There are some estimates that suggest up to 100,000 peasants were murdered at various repressions at the end of the conflict, and we'll perhaps come on to that a little bit later. But like all rebellions, they begin very localized and very small and over very, very tiny sets of demands. And what happened is the peasants consciously attempted to spread their revolt by moving from village to village, forming what they called bands, you might want to call them armies, that then march around the countryside, bring in more peasants, arrive at a village or a town, do a series of speeches and distribute documents and so on, and then spread the revolt. And you get these bands of peasants, these armies roaming around southern Germany, laying siege to castles, evicting people from priests and so on, from religious institutions, taking over whole areas and towns, capturing towns and so on, and spreading the message. And the peasants use all sorts of fascinating ways of spreading it. There's one example which I quote in the book of how peasants used the fact that it was at the beginning of Lent, Shrovetide, to tell the authorities that they were distributing food and cakes between their friends in different villages, when actually they were going around organising meetings and so on. And they used fairs and market days and so on to come together. So really, this is a blossoming of radicalism. It must have been incredible time. You hear of individuals moving all around Germany, spreading and debating ideas, and of course these massive peasant armies moving around, challenging the authorities.
It sounds absolutely amazing. I just wanted to dwell on the question of religion a little bit further, because I think that's something that's relevant for debates today, because there are people on the left who are very dismissive of people who use religious language in modern times in order to revolt. And I'm thinking particularly of the fight against Israel and against imperialism in the Middle East. There are many people fighting back who use religious language rather than secular political language. And there's a tendency sometimes to dismiss them as inherently backwards. But I think it's worth noting in this context of your book that really until the French Revolution of 1789, all class struggles found their expression through religious ideas and language. So can you talk a little bit more about the role that religion played in the upheavals? Maybe unbundle a little bit the significance of what Luther was arguing.
Marxists or socialists who've read radical history might be surprised when they read my book that actually it has got quite a lot of religion in it, because you cannot understand European society in the early years of the 16th century, indeed any period up to sort of 1800s, without understanding it as a deeply religious society. Everyone in that society, almost without exception, believed that the Bible was actual history, believed, for instance, that there were devils or demons that were literally potentially assailing you, believed in the existence of God and an afterlife and so on. And so everything that takes place in the Peasants' Revolt at this time, and indeed all the other struggles of the period, is filtered through that intellectual prism, if you like, of religion. And what Martin Luther does in 1517 is he asks a series of pointed questions of the church. At the time, the church was a monolithic body. We now would refer to it as the Catholic Church, with the Pope at its top in Rome, and everyone paying some sort of service to different aspects of the church. And Martin Luther asked some pointed questions, which, when they were explored, begin to break open the sort of overarching ideology of the church. And the first questions that he were asking were about what today seems a fairly small aspect of church life at the time. It was a question of indulgences. Now, religious believers at the time believed that it was possible for the church, its institutions, its leadership, its hierarchy, and its different individual figures to offer people solace in the afterlife and time off before they left purgatory and entered heaven. And this, over time, had become morphed into a financial transaction. You could pay money, and indeed many people did pay money to improve the speed at which they could get into in heaven. You can imagine, for instance, that if one of your parents had passed away and you were worried that they were in purgatory and would like them to enter heaven quicker, at points in Christian history, people would have prayed and asked God to allow them to do this, and then they might ask the figures in the church to do this on their behalf, and eventually this process would become condensed down into the paying of a financial sum, which would then be granted time off, if you like. And Martin Luther asks a question. He says, essentially, what's happening to the money? Where is this money going? What is being done with it? And if the church, and if the Pope in particular, has the power to grant these sort of indulgences and let people off from the horrors that await them after death, why doesn't he just do it? If he loves everyone, why doesn't he just do it? And if he isn't going to do it, then surely we should have priests and bishops and other figures who will do it. Who will do that for us. And he writes these down in a very long list of theses. He allegedly nails them to a church door in Wittenberg, and with this, he sort of opens up an enormous amount of discussion and debate within the church. That's very, very quickly taken up by at all levels in society, and it's a fascinating process, one that I'm personally very, very interested in. I think is very important in terms of understanding the development of capitalism in Europe, because what started to then happen is that people who felt that their lives were held back by the dogma of the church and by its sort of aged old institutions and the limits that it imposed upon their lives, began to use the language of the Reformation to ask all sorts of further questions. And Martin Luther himself moves on from the sort of what you might call loosely an economic critique of the church into a much more theological debate. And to avoid going on for a very long time about this, what then happens is everyone essentially starts to take up questions and to challenge the authority of the church. And the people you might call the sort of proto-capitalists, they begin to sort of say, well, look, the church limits what we can do, limits how we can borrow money or how we can make money, how much we have to pay an enormous amount of taxes to the church. Surely that should end. And as I said, the people at the bottom of the society interpret it slightly differently. They say, well, maybe we want the right to read the Bible, we want to read it in our own language, but we want to select our priests, and we want to pay less tithes and taxes and so on. So the Reformation, I would argue, isn't the beginning of the Peasants' War. Sometimes historians write that the Reformation starts the Peasants' War, and at the time, certainly Martin Luther was blamed for the rebellion, because everybody who didn't want the peasants' revolt and didn't want to see the rebellion happening kind of saw him as the person who'd started all the ferment in society. What I think is happening is there's all these other forces, and the sort of Reformation is the sort of how can I say, the ideological expression of all those tensions in society, but in a dialectical way, it then feeds back on the tensions in society, feeds back on the population, and encourages them further to stimulate both the questioning of society and the rebellion. And this is expressed most clearly in the individual that you mentioned in the introduction, Thomas Müntzer. Though there are others who we know less likely, and they begin to really question religion and to draw very, very radical and very revolutionary conclusions about the sort of society that could be built and could be lived in.
You mentioned the proto-capitalists. So although the peasants were the overwhelming majority, there were other classes in society, merchants, traders, artisans in the towns, and so on. Did they rise up in solidarity with the peasants? And to what extent were their demands different?
Yes, they did rise up, and we have a whole number of articles and revolutionary demands produced by the rebellious populations of cities around Germany. They are different to the peasants' demands, which reflects the different interests of the population of urban areas. The first thing to understand, though, is there wasn't the separation between town and country that is fundamental to capitalist society. Almost everyone who lived in a town or an urban area had come very recently from the countryside, certainly those at the bottom of of the hierarchy. They often would maintain close links with the countryside, with rural communities, their families in the countryside and so on. More importantly, they were often engaged in some form of economic relationship with the countryside, the trading, the distribution of goods, the purchasing of food and so on. And towns were increasingly becoming centres of production. They were areas, as you say, where merchants came to sell goods, to buy goods and to distribute them and so on. But they were also increasingly areas where production was happening along the lines of more capitalist production, however concentrated on sort of familial units and artisan production and so on. And what often happened is the peasants, the peasant army would arrive at a town and lay siege to it or place some demands on it, and you'd usually be let in. The mass of the population in the towns tended to side with the peasants and see them as allies. Unlike capitalism, where working class revolt tends to pull behind it rural and agricultural and peasant rebellion, if you think of the Russian Revolution and so on. In this era, in the feudal era and in the German Peasants' War, it was the peasants bringing the rebellion to the towns. And there would often be an overlap of joyous coming together of rebellions. The rebellions in the towns were often more easily taken over and sidetracked, if you like, by the richer ruling class in the towns, the wealthier merchants, the sort of elected town leadership, and so on, who often would put their interests into the demands of the rebellion. And when you read them side by side, you do tend to see things like the town and the urban revolts being more concerned with things like taxes or tolls or the right to sell goods or avoiding limitations on the right to trade and so on. You start to see the differing interests between the peasants and the predominantly rural areas and the urban areas where the production is being dominated by, if you like, people on a slightly higher level. And this creates tensions. Not every town does support the peasants. There are big long sieges. The towns often become the site of what you might loosely call the counter-revolution, where they more quickly capitulate to the forces of reaction, and they also then become the centres of where the repression at the end of the revolt continues in terms of trials and executions and so on. But certainly in the early stages, the peasants arrive and pull in the towns behind them, and there is a real expression of how can you say, not so much solidarity as joint rebellion, as people place their own demands.
Let's go on to Thomas Müntzer, who I quoted in the introduction. Reading that comment of his, he could easily be giving a talk in a Socialist Workers Party branch meeting or a solidarity meeting. He's clearly a comrade. He's one of us. And he's not alone. I mean, 120 years after this story, you have the English Revolution, and there's a serious left wing of that revolution who are proposing essentially communist ideas. Tell us a little bit more about Müntzer and what he represented. Did he have support? And what were the barriers for these more radical ideas breaking through and actually winning?
Thomas Müntzer is a great forgotten revolutionary of history, and he's one whose ideas were very much at the heart of the German Peasants' War. He's incredibly well known in many ways to us, not least because of that great quote that you talked about, which essentially captures the way that class society, commodifies natural resources and puts them in the interests of the rich and the powerful, and the rebellion and the instinctive hatred of a society that would take things away from the mass of the population in order to get others wealthy. Müntzer is perhaps best known to the left because he plays a pivotal role in the book that Friedrich Engels writes about the German Peasant War in 1849. And Engels writes, I think, one of his most powerful and beautiful passages about Thomas Müntzer. Because what Engels sees in Müntzer is a revolutionary who's ahead of his time, who's almost out of his time, like a sort of time traveller, a man who has a great vision of how things could be, of a world where actually there isn't exploitation and there isn't oppression, where people are freed up, where the barriers on human self-development are taken away, and where people are freed up to be themselves. Now, Müntzer sees this very much in terms of religion. He begins his, what you might call his adult political life as a follower of Martin Luther. He quickly moves away and develops the ideas of the Reformation in a very distinctive style. He breaks with Luther, and indeed Luther breaks with him, and the two of them exchange very angry, hateful polemics against each other through their lives. And like all great radicals, Müntzer develops his ideas, both in terms of his own engagement with ideas and other people, but in the heat of the struggle as well. Müntzer moves around, and as the German Peasants War breaks out, he travels different parts of Germany and experiences the revolution firsthand, and learns from what people are doing, and he learns from what the ruling class are trying to do and how they're resisting. And by the end of his life, we can see in Müntzer a revolutionary, but one that perhaps, if he had read that text out, we would clap him. But most of his other words are very hard to understand if you're not steeped in the religious ideas of the period. What Müntzer is essentially arguing is that every individual should come to their own understanding and their own relationship with God, and that by doing that, then they can become free and escape the trappings of ordinary life and the limits imposed upon us by the structures of society of 16th century Germany. And what Müntzer does is to essentially say all the political and economic structures that exist in society are holding everyone back from developing that personal relationship with God, and they need to be destroyed, and they need to be destroyed by a revolutionary movement. And so he combines his anger at the material conditions of the world, though one has to be careful because he doesn't, for instance, necessarily see everybody who's a prince or a noble or a lord as the enemy. He combines his frustrations and his understanding of what making people exploited and oppressed with a great desire to see them liberate themselves. He talks about the elect, the group of enlightened religious individuals who come to God of their own volition, through their own activity, through their own learning, and are then going to lead everyone else into the future. But they have to destroy the old order before that can happen, and that leads him into revolutionary conflict with princes. And indeed, he leads an army onto one of the great final battles of the German Peasants' War in May of 1525. Now, Müntzer is also well known because he was targeted at the time by the enemies of the rebellion, by the nobility, and accused of what we would today call communism. He is supposed to have said on his deathbed that he was for all things to be held in common. It's the quote that is always associated with Thomas Müntzer, the idea that wealth would be redistributed to everyone. This, unfortunately, is almost certainly not true. And comrades who want to learn more about this, I highly recommend a book by a British socialist called Andy Drummond, his recent biography of Thomas Müntzer, which explores this, and I think proves without a doubt that Müntzer wouldn't have been the sort of person who would have talked about all things being held in common. Nonetheless, the ruling class believed he did things, and they punished him with the most appalling torture. But crucially, they used these words and the belief that Müntzer was a revolutionary who wanted to destroy the old order, to discredit and undermine the rebellion itself in the eyes of everyone else. And this becomes the the point, if you like, of Martin Luther's critique of Thomas Müntzer, a real attack on him for these sort of proto-communists, that I'm using contemporary words, not Martin Luther's words. And this is why, in many ways, Müntzer is such an amazing figure to us, because his radicalism was terrifying to the ruling class at the time. Well, Thomas Müntzer became a radical figure and an inspiration to radicals and revolutionaries ever since, a bit like the way that figures like Wat Tyler from the English Rebellion of 1381 have become kind of touchstones for radicals. Müntzer was somebody who, throughout European history since the rebellion, became sort of emblematic of both the desire to overthrow society, but also the potential to reconstruct it in a new way. So we have to understand and sort of pick apart the religious beliefs of Thomas Müntzer, and certainly the religious language he uses to sort of reach the core of his vision of a sort of emancipatory politics. It is very different to the politics of revolutionary socialism today, but in many ways it has parallels and similarities, and certainly came, I think, from the same instinct, a belief that the world is wrong and needs to be changed.
How did the ruling class succeed in crushing this revolt? It was on a massive scale, and could the peasants have won? And what would a society where the peasants had won, what would it have looked like?
To answer the second question first, could the peasants have won, I think, is tied into the way that we talked about Thomas Müntzer, because Engels, as I said, saw him as a figure out of time. He describes him as a sort of revolutionary who's doomed because he has a vision, but it's an unattainable one. And it's unattainable not because there was any lack of bravery, and certainly not because there were any lack of revolutionaries. As we've talked about, the peasants rebelled in their hundreds of thousands, and they inflicted major defeats upon the German ruling class of the time. Hundreds and hundreds of castles were burnt, hundreds and hundreds of towns were captured, hundreds of places wrote their own declarations and demands of their local lords, and sometimes those were granted and won, and sometimes incredible scenes where very, very wealthy or very, very powerful figures had to essentially meet with the peasants and grant them their demands. But these are pushed away, and the defeat comes not because of any lack of bravery or any strength in numbers, though those are important. The ruling class is better, its armies are more powerful, its armies are better equipped. Crucially, they have more money to hire mercenaries from elsewhere in Europe. I think that the peasants are doomed because there's no way that they can realise the material society that they want. Their vision for a sort of local democratic utopian order where there's democratic control could only realise itself if the feudal order is smashed and destroyed completely. And the peasants weren't powerful enough to do that. They weren't powerful enough to do that because to do so would have meant essentially defeating feudalism as a set of political economic institutions, and of course defeating its army. And they were unable to do that. And that means that really it's a lost cause in many ways. And certainly I think by the end of the Peasants' War, which takes place at the end of May and the early part of June 1525, you see a series of pitched battles between the forces of the ruling class, feudal armies that are marching around southern Germany and smashing peasant armies as they go. These are better equipped, they're better armed, they're often mercenary armies, and while they have taken some time to gather and to unite, the shock of the rising is enough to put the ruling class on the back foot for many, many weeks. When they do encounter pitched battles with the peasantry, they almost always win. And when they win, they impose the most bloody repression. Tens of thousands of peasants are slaughtered. And the ones that aren't slaughtered are often hung in mass executions, and their leaders are tortured and violently executed. And this is perhaps epitomised by the famous battle that takes place, of which Thomas Müntzer is one of the leading figures, at the Battle of Frankenhausen. Frankenhausen, the best estimates suggest that the peasants had about 8,000 people in their army, which had arrayed itself at the top of a hill and saw a slightly larger ruling class army come to capture it. And there were several thousand more supporters in the town of Frankenhausen. And Thomas Muntzer's at the top of the hill. He makes a famous speech urging people to fight and promising that he's had a vision from God that the cannonballs won't harm them. And of course, this doesn't happen, and the peasants break and run under the attack from the ruling class. As I said, there were 8,000 people there. The best estimate is about 3,000 of them were killed on the battlefield, and another 2,000 or 3,000 people were slaughtered in the town of Frankenhausen. And those sort of figures and that sort of percentage aren't uncommon. In fact, there's a letter, again, which I quote in the book, from one member of one leading general or figure in an army to another one, who makes the point that they have to be careful about how many peasants they kill because there won't be anybody to bring the crops in. Nonetheless, the bloodshed is absolutely horrific. We shouldn't be surprised by this. We know that the forces of the state, the forces of the ruling class, will use violent repression to stop rebellion. That was true in the English Revolution of 1381. It was true in Germany in 1525, and it's been true in numerous risings and rebellions and revolutions ever since. But it essentially destroys the ability of people to resist and rebel, and if you like, stops the potential for further rebellion. One final thing needs to be put into this context, though. Martin Luther, who, as I said, had begun the Reformation and was seen by many as starting the rebellion and seen indeed by many peasants as being their person. Martin Luther was the most outspoken encourager of the violent rebellion. He wrote a series of pamphlets that are literally bone-chilling to blood-curdling pamphlets, in which he exhorts those who see themselves as God's followers to go out and smite the peasants, to murder them, to kill them. And he even says that they will be absolved of sin if they do that, because the peasants have created the biggest sin by rebelling against the church and rebelling against a society. And that really is the end of the revolt, and the defeat of the peasantry as a class. And indeed, as Engels writes in his own book, the only real victors were the princes and the nobility. All those other parts of German society that had begun to flex their muscles, the merchant classes, the peasants, the small producers, and so on, they're left defeated. And Germany, its historical development, is held back by the defeat of the Peasants' War, because the old aristocratic landowning class is re-entrenched in its power by the outcome of the rebellion.
Thanks for taking us through all this. It's absolutely fascinating, and I would encourage people to think about getting your book. I believe copies are on their way from Britain to Australia as we speak. But just to sort of finish off, perhaps we can fast forward 500 years, because today we face a brutal ruling class that's driving us to the brink of environmental catastrophe. It's engaged in an increasingly frantic drive to build up military strength for impending wars, and it's presiding over massive poverty and inequality. And I think it's clear we need our own revolt. So looking back to 1525, what lessons can we draw from then that can help us be successful against our own feudal lords?
We do need our own revolt. And I think one of the fascinating things about the Peasants' War is that while it was a very, very different society, there are great parallels. You could even point out that the peasants of Europe had suffered an enormous catastrophe in a great plague that had spread across Europe, and they had suffered enormously as a result of that. The environmental aspects, there are real parallels, as the lands across Europe were being privatized and taken away from ordinary people so that they couldn't collect wood, they couldn't fish the lakes and the rivers, they couldn't gather resources and food from the land as their predecessors had done. And this privatization of land, this sort of separation of humanity from the natural world, was a real feature of the rebellion and discontent. And of course, the enormous waste of wealth and resources, not just in terms of the appalling concentration of wealth in the hands of the feudal lords, which perhaps mimics the way that the incredibly rich today are lording it over us. Indeed, there was a family of bankers, the Fugger family. Jacob Fugger was widely considered still to have been the richest man ever to have lived. He has his parallels with Elon Musk, perhaps. But the other, of course, way that the warring feudal lords constantly took wealth and resources out of the land and out of communities and wasted them on battles and fighting that had no interest and benefit to ordinary people. So there are enormous parallels, of course. Can we develop any lessons, if you like? I think the first thing to say is that one of the great lessons of the German Peasant War is that democracy really matters. That what made those armies of peasants so effective and so wonderful was the fact that they allowed ordinary people to make decisions about the rebellion themselves, and the accounts of the rebellion are filled with the way that people discussed and debated what they needed to do. As I said, they elected their officers, they elected their leading figures, they created their own systems of punishment for people who transgressed them. They tried to manage resources, and even things like looting, the looting of a captured castle, for instance. There were ways that they democratically divided the spoils and the captured loot amongst the army, so that nobody benefited from anywhere else. And this also helped impose discipline. So the armies, while they were weaker than the ruling classes' armies, they were very, very disciplined bodies that certainly didn't break and run necessarily when they first encountered any hostile fire. I think the other lesson that we have to take from the Peasants' War is that you should be careful who your leaders are. In a number of cases, as is quite common actually of peasant revolts in Europe this period, the peasants had no real experience of rebellion, and so they often asked local landlords or lords to put themselves at the head of their rebellion and followed those orders. And they then found themselves in a difficult position when, of course, those leaders weren't willing to follow through. And so, everyone needs a Thomas Müntzer. Everyone needs an outspoken revolutionary who is thinking about the world, understands the world, and has got a strategy to win. I think the very final thing is numbers. Numbers is what matters. The German Peasant War wasn't about small groups of individuals trying to do it on behalf of everyone. It was about ordinary people in their masses together, women and men, because women did play a central role in the Peasants' Revolt and the Peasants' War. Women and men fighting collectively to change their society, and in the process changing themselves. And while they were defeated, Europe would never be the same again. That was the amazing thing. And the Reformation couldn't be held back. It changed and became a different Reformation. But the peasants and people from below had driven through all sorts of changes which fundamentally altered the economic and political landscape of Europe.
Thank you so much, Martin. Really enjoyed the discussion. Thank you for your time.